Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us for the ACSI No School, No Problem webinar hosted by Erin Wilcox. Dr. Wilcox is our Assistant Vice President of Academic Services, and she's responsible for accreditation, certification, and supporting schools with international students. She spent 20 years at Colorado Springs Christian Schools, and she was the technology coordinator, the middle school principal, and associate superintendent responsible for the educational program. Erin also has taught how to teach online in the online master's program for educational technology for Grand Canyon University, and brings a wealth of information as we look at how to transition school learning to online in the event of school closures. Erin, why don't you go ahead and get started?
Thank you, Heather. What do we do when we can't have school? I cringe when I hear congressmen and other government officials make simple statements about closing schools and moving the education online. I wonder how some school leaders feel who really don't know what to do. The questions below will be our outline for this presentation. You will see that there's a website posted at the bottom of this page. That's ACSI's coronavirus resource page. I have posted a PDF list of resources on that page. Whenever I mention a website or web application, you will find information about it on that resource page. You will also find a recording of this webinar there once our team is able to post the recording. And I will post a copy of the slide deck of this presentation as well, so you won't have to be quickly taking notes. Well, here are our questions. What is an online instruction day? Is that the same as an online course? How can we get started? And how can we do this well? What are some of the resources we might need? What can we do to prepare for this now? If we don't cover a question that you might have on your mind, there will be time for us to ask and answer those at the end. As the coronavirus spreads, the CDC is telling us that schools will play an important role. That only makes sense. School is a place where people gather and share the air, which is how this virus is spread. Children do not seem to be hard hit with this virus, but because of their less than stellar health habits, when they do get even mildly sick, they may be carriers to more vulnerable population. It's like grandparents and younger siblings with health issues. If local health officials report that there's a concentration of cases of the virus, or COVID-19 as it's also known in your community, schools may take proactive steps to prevent the spreading of the virus in schools. We've already seen that in New York, California, Washington State, and of course, internationally. So the first step for schools is to stay in touch with local officials now and as this progresses. CDC's guidance includes considerations to plan for the continuity of teaching and learning if there's community spread of the virus in your area. Temporarily dismissing childcare programs in K-12 schools is a strategy to stop or slow the further spread of the virus. If schools are dismissed, schools should have a plan that ensures the continuity of education. They suggest that schools implement e-learning plans as feasible and appropriate as possible. They say to determine this, consult with education or state officials. And in the case of private schools, your accreditor is another important voice in this equation. A waiver may be needed for state requirements of minimum number of in-person instructional hours or school days, seat time for counting the school days in some states. However, if your health department says close, then close. Next, find out how to convert face-to-face lessons to online lessons. And then, of course, train your teachers to do that well. That's where this presentation comes in. Let me tell you my story. My former school, Colorado Springs Christian Schools, ran out of snow days in October of 2006, and we had to come up with a plan to make it through the rest of the year. Public schools were adding minutes to days and days to the end of the school year. But with how far our students commuted to the school, that would have been terribly difficult for us. So we decided to use our new learning management system, Moodle, to create online instruction days to help us solve the problem. The first time we called one of those online instruction days, in place of a snow day, the local TV station came out and interviewed me. I also ended up on NPR, National Public Radio, for an interview. Well, now it's 2020, and I've been working for ACSI for the past 5 years, but I still see the TV news scroll come on, CSES's online instruction days instead of snow days. Colorado Springs is actually having one of those kind of weather years again this year, and CSES is still finding it very valuable. Let's clear up some definitions. These two sound very similar, online classes and online instruction days. Well, online classes are a whole course taught by the semester or year where the curriculum is delivered online, and it's often delivered by a third party. Whereas an online instruction day is one or more days used only as needed when instruction continues in between what would typically be classes in a brick and mortar school. And we're talking about that second kind, online instruction days. First of all, find out if they're allowed in your state. Wisconsin is one of those states that until just in January, public schools were allowed to do it, but not private schools. But in January, that was changed. But if it's prohibited in your state, write an appeal to include it in your pandemic flu plan in case your school's shut down for X number of days. My counsel would be to prepare for it anyway. In this case that your state would feel pressure to shut down, if the health department tells you or the governor tells you to close school, you need to do that. What are your current capabilities? I suggest you begin to look at what can your school do. Do you have a student management system? Regardless of whether you use RenWeb, PowerSchool, Blackbaud, or some other program, most have the ability to post assignments, but some have additional features like posting other types of media, videos, and so forth. Since teachers are familiar with that system, start there. Explore the possibilities of that first. Next, explore the other systems that your school has. Could be a learning management system like Moodle, Google Classroom, Schoology, or possibly even Microsoft Teams. Those are learning management systems. Many are free and have different capabilities that will help shape what you can offer your students. They function more like a classroom. Next, if you're not on top of what your SMS and LMS or other collaborative work environments can do, then I recommend that you identify your best IT person, your most tech-savvy educators, and give them some release time. Have them come up with some specific ideas for your systems that relate to your school, your grade levels, and things that your teachers could learn. It wouldn't help if ACSI posted plans from some other school if your team cannot implement and support those. Then develop the structure that your school will use. Here's a simple outline of what our school used. You can take these ideas and modify them to fit your environment. So you call the online instruction day by, say, 5:30 or something like that, like a delayed start. But of course, you would modify that if you were going to be out of school for 2 to 3 weeks. You might have advance notice, but in some of these cases, they're not getting much advance notice. You might get one day or even the night before. Teachers post the instructional activities on their classroom page, and I'll have some examples of what that instruction might look like later. Remember to check the resources page for instructional websites. Well, we posted our instruction by 10 a.m. or sometimes earlier. Again, if this were several weeks, you might pick an earlier time because your teachers could have it ready the night before when it's an ongoing situation. Then students know that they can log in and find their work on a classroom page. Students in grades K to 2 should have items that can be sent home, like a packet, maybe math, reading, spelling worksheets, or activities that can be mostly done offline with parents, maybe some science experiments or Bible activities, and of course, reading books. Parents of students in those grades typically don't want to sit at the computer for several hours a day. Also, if a big brother or sister needs the computer, it's best if the little ones aren't on it for a long time. For an extended amount of time out of school, there are great websites the school can provide for skills and enrichment. And early education would be similar. Our early ed folks are planning to provide their own resource page. So for you with younger children, be sure to check that out. Students in grades 3 to 5 should have a mix of instruction that can be printed and done offline, and some that can be done on the computer. A student at this level should always have a good chapter book to read at home. The interactive learning games, nature programs, instructional math and science videos for this group are amazing. There are also a lot of drill and practice programs available for supplemental work, which can be tailored for individual levels. And if keyboarding is a goal, you may want to look into programs you can have students use at home to learn or practice those skills, since most students are going to have access to a keyboard. Students in grades 6 to 12 can be expected to spend more time on the computer as they're more independent in their computer skills. A typical online instruction sequence might include short segments of online instruction and then applications such as answering questions, writing an essay, responding to a discussion thread, or answering an online quiz. Depending on the class, this will vary, of course. An interactive field trip, simulation, or online lab would take more concentrated time. But teachers must realize that just like they have a variety of learning activities in school, they should have that same approach to teaching and learning at home. It's important to be sensitive to the constraints of multi-student families, of course. Start training your teachers first. Have them bring sample lessons or a few that they would like to convert to online instruction and practice together. Have them critique each other's lessons. They have to figure out what actually qualifies as online instruction. The goal is instruction and not just assignments. It must be real instruction, not just busy work at home. Here's a few examples of resources they can find. Today's textbook publishers often have video segments with teachers teaching the concepts or additional activities for reteaching and enrichment. These can be accessed by the students logging in via the computer. It's an excellent resource you've already paid for. And there are websites with many teaching videos like Khan Academy. It may be slightly different than your teachers would teach it, but it's a great resource and many have follow-up activities included. So here's a picture of Khan Academy. So you can see that it's easy to search by subject, level, and then an appropriate lesson. Many have teaching videos that can be used in place of actual teaching presentation of the material. Also from Khan Academy, students can be put into class groups and then assigned individual learning plans, or the teacher can use one video for the whole class, like this one, Understanding Division of Fractions. So the teacher walks through the sequence and takes the kids through the actual lesson. The advantage of this is that students can watch it as many times as needed and even access additional review materials before taking the associated quiz. It becomes a personalized learning experience. More techniques. One of the easiest for teachers to use is the same PowerPoint that they were going to use in class the next day. Usually, these are already created and they just add their own narration, which is actually very easy. You can even show the teacher's face by video while they're recording. Or if they're in their pajamas, maybe you should just add the photo instead. Students will feel connected to their own teacher through that video and their voice. They're hearing and seeing the next lecture they would have seen in class the next day. But I want to warn you, copyright permissions change with online instruction because the law considers anything you put online as being published. So be sure to use copyright-free photos. You're no longer just in your classroom, and so it's quite different. And for-profit schools have slightly different laws even yet to contend with. So I've given you a reference on the resource page where you can get more information on intellectual property. One point that you might find interesting is that when you're providing a link to a site, you do not need to request permission. But if you want to actually download a resource like a PDF or a photo and embed it in your site, you do need to request permission. You are in effect republishing that resource, even though you might be behind a password protected site. So please have someone at your school read that information and summarize that for your teacher so you're not in violation of that copyright law. There are several free video capture software tools that capture things like 5-minute videos, short pieces of teaching that the teacher can do while they're presenting material. And additional tools with these programs vary, like whiteboards that might make them especially good for math. There are lots of simulations, virtual labs, and things like that. And foreign language is another class that will surprise people with how many programs are fantastic and available out there. There are thousands of websites that teach the same or very similar concepts that your teachers would be teaching if they were in class. And these can be found by just doing a web search and then the very specific target topic. See that resource page for these sites. And I suggest you look at that resource page also because there's a suggestion about updating your permission slips. Filters and supervision become the parent's responsibility when the student's at home. And so it's really important that you update those permission slips. If you listen to the webinar by Fisher and Phillips that's posted on our coronavirus page, you know that many of your permission slips are probably out of date now with this virus. So listen to that if you've not had the chance. It was excellent. Here's an example of a social studies activity that I found on PBS. Sometimes these are reenactments, sometimes they're actual historical footage. This one came not only with the video, but it provided discussion questions, vocabulary, a teacher's guide, and you can see on the left that it shows how it automatically can connect to a Google Classroom if that's what you use. One of the staples in online instruction is the PHET, Interactive Simulations for Physics. These are level specific. You can see that along the left side. It goes from elementary all the way to university level, and they're all interactive. There are teaching segments, and then the students can manipulate the items in them to explore the concept. For example, I chose an activity called the Balancing Act, covering balance, proportional reasoning, and torque. This one had teaching, practice, and then a game following it, where you move the pieces and then they judge you right or wrong. I guess I was doing okay when I grabbed this screenshot. It's a good thing I didn't go too much farther. I'm glad I quit because my score was okay. They're a lot of fun, so they're very motivational for students. There are virtual labs that are comparable or better equipped than many high school or even community college labs that have had to shut down because of cost and the danger of keeping chemicals and so forth. Virtual labs currently offer chemistry, biology, and physics experiments. Some are actually created to complement like commercial textbooks. This one shows McGraw-Hill there, but they've been opened up and they're free to everybody. You will find some incredible resources. This one shows an earthworm dissection, but you can find full frog dissections and all kinds of things. There are a number of sites that have actual courses or parts of courses. This is an example of AP Physics put together by a number of AP Physics teachers for review and practice for students preparing for the exam. It's simply one example of a tool that could be incorporated into an online instruction day. And for the highest level classes, like AP or dual enrollment college classes, teachers may want to have a segment of time where they allow or schedule synchronous or live sessions using a tool like Zoom so they can continue their instruction, because passing those tests have such high stakes associated with them. Missing several days in a row might set students back too far. And there are free web conferencing tools out there or free versions of some of the more expensive tools. These sessions may still need to be recorded because not all students may be able to join at the same time. But what makes a satisfying classroom experience, especially if you're going to be 2 or 3 weeks into this kind of thing? Think about the environment that holds all the instruction together as your base. That's why a Google Classroom, Moodle, or Schoology is so important. It feels like a classroom. It can hold the morning greeting, lay out the plan for the day for elementary, or the objectives for the period for secondary. Give students the contact information they need, a short greeting, a prayer, a verse, something to anchor them that says, I'm here, just like always, simply coming to you in a different way. Remember to address the social and emotional needs of your students. Would you normally say happy birthday to a student? Add that greeting. Think about the possibility that these students may be struggling with being out of school and away from friends. Find some ways to let the students connect and reflect on this upheaval that they're feeling. It is important that teachers create a positive learning environment. If students sense that this is a horrible burden for the teachers, it won't go well for them. Teachers who can create a sense of adventure will create a good learning environment for students, and it will no doubt go better for everyone. And leaders, you need to model that for your teachers. Students need to be able to come back to the homepage and find elements of the lesson, the learning activities, the video clips, or whatever else you post. Parents should be able to see the flow of the day's instruction and help their students make sense of what needs to be done and what is still ahead. The classroom page functions as that home base. People have suggested that Zoom, Skype, or other web conferencing tools could be their entire plan for online instruction. What about just turning on FaceTime? Well, I don't recommend that. You can think of these tools as the lecture part. Do they have their place? Of course, but they're not the best way to organize the online experience for students. You should minimize the expectation for synchronous meetings. Not every student has the technology to be online at the same time. Live instruction can be a limited part of instruction for the more mature student. But if you think about multiple children families, they only have one computer to share probably, and it would be very difficult for some of them. These programs must have the ability to record, and some of the free programs are limited in this. Some video conferencing programs create very large files, and those are difficult. Zoom, for example, creates a very large file, and you may create difficulties for your school's server storage capacity quickly and not even realize it. Short recorded segments can be easily included in a unit or lesson, but they should not be the primary delivery mechanism. Good pedagogy for online instruction would be short segments of teacher instruction or other learning experience, followed by some sort of student response. Think 5 to 10 minutes of instruction broken up by questions, activities, threaded discussions, journal responses, or other type of group or independent processing. Getting students to respond to what they just heard, saw, or read is key, because online there isn't the eye contact or the proximity that we use in the physical classroom. But there are a lot of opportunities for individualization and collaboration as you allow students to respond with programs like Seesaw or Padlet. Tap into programs that have some computer-graded elements so that students get immediate feedback, and so teachers don't increase their grading workload. Quizzes can be set up in programs like Quizlet or sites like Khan Academy where they come built in. Google Classroom, Schoology, and Moodle have included quiz makers built right in. Think good pedagogy like you would in the classroom. Surveys and polls can be easily built in SurveyMonkey, FormStack, or Moodle, and be used to gather responses after students have watched a video clip or like from Romeo or Juliet, or a segment from history archives like the Smithsonian. Show students the results of the next day. It's very motivational. There are millions of primary sources which can be found on sites like the Library of Congress. Students can listen to or read those and reflect on or discuss them. Involve your library media specialists in the hunt for curriculum-related sites, and you will see that there's a gold mine out there. Depending on the LMS used by the school or their access to something like Google Classroom, students can work on interactive group projects that will enhance their learning. For example, pre-assigned groups can collaborate on a shared document in Google Docs. Peer editing for papers can also be accomplished this way. Threaded discussions are handled easily in Moodle, and even in Turnitin.com, which some schools have subscriptions to already. And while we're on the topic of threaded discussions, they're a great way to do biblical integration. They replace the brick and mortar classroom discussions where much of biblical integration happens anyway. Here's an example of a Google Classroom. The teacher has created a student conversation, a question, and topics with posts. Very simple, but it keeps the students organized. Here is a sample Moodle classroom. The teacher has posted the syllabus for the unit, a welcome, a greeting, a video, primary source documents, which are PDFs, a quiz, additional resources, and a calendar for the various activities and when they're due. Students can use Google Classrooms, Schoology, and Moodle to turn in all their assignments. Assessment needs to be factored into the lesson. Is the student doing something that shows what they have learned and that they have progressed? There should be something that is at least marked for completion. Often the work will receive a letter grade, but there should at least be tangible evidence that the student is engaging and mastering the objectives. For our online instruction days, teachers were allowed to give homework. It was similar to what they would have given if the student would have been in class. Sometimes it was changed a little because the instruction was different, but we stressed that the objectives should be nearly the same, if not identical. We recommended that the amount of time the student was responsible for engaging with each class be shortened a little from a normal period. We asked them to treat the time frames as they would a delayed start, since students were not typically getting the work until about 10 a.m. And they needed to remember that multiple sibling part. When designing lessons, teachers might not be able to include all the elements of a great lesson in one period. They did have to consider the class in the context of a larger unit. Administrators had to monitor the instruction to see that it met our specifications. Now, let me give you some nuts and bolts, kind of tips from the trenches. We required that students log in every day for attendance. An LMS will track that for you. One of the biggest downfalls of any online instruction is when students procrastinate. Building in attendance and daily completion or grades will help combat that. If a student was sick, their parent had to email our attendance monitor. Teachers received that information and allowed makeup work just like they would at school. We made arrangements for students who did not have the internet or a device on a case-by-case basis. This was a small number at our school, and they all made arrangements with a neighbor or they took their student to work with them. They understood it was a requirement and they found a way to comply. Now, many schools have iPads or Chromebooks or laptops that could be checked out to students who didn't own a device. We provided support during the day. There was an email address that students or parents could write to if they forgot their password or experienced another type of difficulty. Our LMS was easy to use, so the tech difficulties were minimal after the first few days. Students were taught to keep copies of everything they submitted. When they said, the computer ate my homework, they were told, provide the backup copy. If they could not, it was considered late. Most students got in the habit of just sending themselves a copy via email. We only asked teachers in the Core Plus classes to post instruction, and that meant to us the 5 core classes, English, Math, Social Studies, Science, and Bible, and any academic special. And we defined those as foreign language, computer, things like that. Classes that did not post instruction were choir, band, PE, those kinds of classes. If online instruction days extended for a long period of time, the school would need to create alternate assignments for those classes as well. And there are some amazing sites for art and some other subjects. Research says humor significantly influences student interest and participation, but has no effect on overall course performance. Since most instruction is asynchronous, humor is most effective through cartoons, illustrations, photographs, and captions for those items. Use it sparingly and in good taste, but do remember the copyright laws. Don't forget about the other aspects of schools. Teachers need support from administrators and the tech team. They need to meet together for ideas. On the bottom of the resource page, there is a link to some articles. One is specifically for leaders. Although short, it will remind you to take care of the faculty as well. Finally, increase communication to parents. This period of time will feel very destabilizing for parents, and they may have many questions. Use the website, post FAQs, use text, email, and whatever communication works well with your families. Start gradually. To begin this process, we had teachers bring students to the computer lab on a staggered basis and log in so each student had time to practice. They completed and submitted a simple assignment through our LMS. And doing this for each Core Plus class for grades 3 to 12, they became very familiar with how to do it. And by the time we did our practice days at home, there were very few problems. Those problems were due to the lack of internet or equipment problems, and parents quickly corrected this. And then we did this once at the beginning of each year so that the new teachers and new students were familiar with it as well. The first 2 times we had an online instruction day, students were given grace on assignments if they came in and told us about any difficulties they had. We didn't want their grades impacted because of unfamiliarity with the process or technical difficulties. We warned parents that these first 2 days were trial days. The assignments counted, but we gave grace. However, that pushed parents to fix their internet, get their printers working, or make arrangements for students to go to neighbors if they didn't have the internet. And it worked. This helped teachers get comfortable with the plan as well. So what can you do to prepare? First, make choices about an LMS, get that online environment working, like Google Classroom, whatever. Choose something, start learning it, and start using it. Train teachers on the basics. Create a few practice lessons together. Have students come to the computer lab, log in, complete some assignments. Let them get comfortable with the process. Try a similar activity from home. That helps you find the bugs and who's lacking equipment. Create working groups so that you can prepare students for certain activities like discussions or group projects. And then practice any computer skills your students don't have. Some of them may not know how to upload a file or do a web search or whatever else you need them to do. All in all, it was a tremendous success, but it does take maintenance. We continued to do in-services over the years to resource teachers on better tools and new skills. We had to train new teachers as they came on board. However, we found that the technology training we did for this online instruction positively impacted our regular instruction, and students benefited from more engaging teaching all year long. The online lessons were retained from year to year and even improved for the future. Teachers developed a library of Moodle lessons Students became more comfortable in the online environment, even though they never took an official online class. One example I like to tell is about our 6th grade Bible teacher who tried threaded discussions for the first time. Remember, these are 6th graders. Normally in the 6th grade classroom, only the outgoing or confident students raised their hands in discussions. For the online discussion, she required that the students respond to her prompt or the replies of 3 other students. And every student shared in the online environment. As the day went on, students shared and shared and shared. They kept on sharing 6 or 8 more times. She also noticed that several shy students responded to the most popular kids' posts and vice versa. And what was even more exciting to her was that she saw this continue as kids got back into the regular classroom. She considered this a tremendous success and continued to use threaded discussions even when she didn't have a snow day. I found that other teachers also discovered techniques or websites that worked so well, they became part of the regular teaching and learning sequence. The silver lining for us was that technology integration got a huge boost from teachers seeking good online instruction options. The key was we made sure that teachers did not think that just posting homework or assignments would suffice. That does not substitute for real instruction. We were able to use this at our school for snow days, of course, but also for a few days when a water main broke, when the heat would not come on, and other similar situations. We wrote this into our pandemic flu plan years ago. As you plan for what might come, I hope you are prepared to say, no school, no problem. Ecclesiastes 3:1 says, there's a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. This is a challenge that could turn into an opportunity. I hope you embrace it and say, our school is ready for online learning. Well, that brings the presentation to a conclusion, and I think we're ready for some questions.
We sure are. Thank you very much, Erin. We have our first question going on right now. That is, what do you do about issues where parents are still working and students are at home? The school's closed, but the parents are still required to work, especially when you look at the younger kids. Did you encounter this here in Colorado? And if so, how did you resolve it?
Well, we informed our parents that this was going to occur and that they were responsible to supervise their students, and they all made arrangements either with a neighbor, a couple of parents went together, or they made provisions to work from home. But they understood that they were responsible for supervising their students. And I think all around the country, when you have schools that are mandating that the students stay home, that is an expectation.
Very good. And I just want to let our listeners, our audience know that we also have Philip Scott in the office. He's our in-house counsel here at ACSI. And if we delve into any legal type questions, he's on tap to provide some answers for us. We had another question come in. How do you preserve the integrity of assessment when in an online environment?
It depends on what kind of assessment. If you have a program like Moodle, Google Classroom, and Schoology, those students are logging in, it's password protected, and I think that that individual student is answering that quiz or whatever. But I think you also have to be creative in your assessments. So if you have a student writing an essay and they turn in an essay and it's similar to the work that they have been doing, that's consistent in the level of work. And then if an older brother or sister turns in that work and it looks very different, you can tell that's probably not their work. But that's the same thing that would happen in a normal classroom if all of a sudden an essay or a paper came in that was not consistent. So I think you have to inform parents that they have a responsibility. I think that would also go in that permission slip. If you send home the expectations, you need to tell parents that the work that's being done online is being graded the same as work that's being graded in the classroom. And just like homework is expected to be done by the student, or papers, research papers, whatever, that what's being turned into these classroom environments needs to be done by the student. The parent needs to sign that and turn that in. So I think the importance of laying out expectations, getting the parents to sign that would be key when you begin this.
Perfect. We have somebody who wrote in and said that we utilize Google Classroom for 3rd grade and up, and all students have an email. Oh, since Google Classroom is tied to an email address, do you assign email addresses to your younger students? My apologies.
Younger than 3rd grade? Are they asking?
The question came from somebody who didn't specify an age. They just said younger children.
Okay, that's one reason I differentiate between 3rd grade and up. I do think 3rd grade and up can manage the Google Classroom, Moodle classrooms, that kind of thing. I think the K to 2, you're primarily communicating with parents.
Very good. Can you elaborate on the K2 instruction that you've mentioned?
I think primarily that is more packet-based or sending things to parents. So for example, if you're sending a packet home, if you have a day in advance that you know this is going home, send home a packet of information. If it's going to extend for several weeks, then I think sending home some websites that say, here's some math, places that they can go and get some math quizzing, some spelling words, so those kinds of things. But I think you have to think in terms of the parent is the person you're communicating to in that K2 environment, and here's some resources for parents. But beyond, from 3rd grade on up, that changes that you've got the classroom environment and the student is logging in and they're doing some things online and some things they can bring and do offline.
Perfect. Somebody asked whether you have included any resources on the resource guide for early education.
The early ed folks were planning to do their own resource guide, and I have not yet seen if it's posted, but they are planning to post an entire resource guide for early ed.
Perfect. And once we have that, we will put that up on our website. I do just want to, as we're pausing real quick in the questions, I want to remind everybody that this webinar is being recorded. It will be posted up on the coronavirus resource webpage. There will be a link to that recording. We're also putting the slides up, and we'll include both resource guides, the one that Dr. Wilcox has already prepared and that came out in your email, as well as the one for early education. So for early, let's see, we have a question. At what point do we close our schools if our local public school district closes and other private schools may or may not?
Wow, that's a good question. I think you have to stay in touch with your local health department, your whoever you look for guidance from that. If you've got a mixed group of people, some schools have deep connections with their public schools, and that's who's providing their lunch program, or they have a lot of families that have a number of children in the public school and some children in their private school. So I think there's not an answer that would be a one-size-fits-all here. You would have to look at how many connections you have to the public school system. Do you have busing that goes alongside of it? There's just too many connection questions that you need to answer for that.
Yeah, Philip Schuyler, from a risk standpoint, public schools are going to have more protection just because they're a government entity than a private actor like our schools are. So one of our recommendations would be, if you're being in touch with your county health department, if they're giving a recommendation, they may not require you to close, but even if they're recommending that you close, our suggestion would be you go ahead and take that. If the public schools around you are closing, again, I think that's probably a strong indicator that you should consider whether you should do the same or not, because in the context of just the risk associated, it's going to come back to what duty did you owe the children that you're caring for, which is going to be a higher standard than, say, one for adults who kind of make that choice. And so I would take great pause if the public schools around you are closing, that you may need to follow suit.
Very good. Back into instruction for elementary students. Does the teacher post lessons for all subjects, English, math, science, and Bible, just the same as a regular school day?
I think the answer is yes. So our teachers did. Again, we did not have the weeks going, our experience did not include weeks on end, but I think an elementary teacher would have to be responsible for that. You might take a view that you were going to concentrate on certain things, certain days, and maybe social studies one day, science another. So you could do some alternating days, but some of the, you would just have to decide what you're going to focus on each day. But yes, I think if that's what you're responsible for, that's what you're responsible for.
Great. Another question that's come in is, what is your experience with or your recommendation about using Microsoft Teams rather than Google Classroom?
I do not have personal experience using Microsoft Teams. I think I've seen that they have some areas for teachers, and I think you could explore that if your school's familiar with that, because they do have a lot of sharing capabilities. But having students use it, I don't have enough experience with that to say it would do all of the things that these other products do.
Great. And what happens if you have a student flat out not do the work? What would the consequences be other than an absence charge and maybe a 0 on those assignments?
Yeah, you would have to give them a 0 on the assignment. You'd have to explain to parents that this is how school's being run, and they have to do the work or take the 0.
Okay. Somebody just posted a comment that we might be able to talk about. I saw something that encouraged a day in the middle of the week, like a Wednesday, to be used for students to catch up and teachers to catch up also and reassess where they are and or work with one another. Any thoughts?
I think you could develop kind of an ebb and flow. Some schools, what comes to mind is some schools use a 4-day school week. Some schools do Wednesday afternoons where they get out for professional development. All of those things are plans that, a variety of schedules that schools use, depending on how my school used the model of a little bit shorter day, all 5 days. I think as long as you are responsible, having the students be responsible for the work, that how you actually schedule it is absolutely up to the school. But you are responsible for accomplishing the objectives in the curriculum. When students are working individually, they tend to work faster than they do in a classroom. So that is up to you how you lay out the objectives from your curriculum, but you are basically responsible for what's in your curriculum.
Perfect. Another person asked the question, any advice about block scheduling and how to handle that?
Same thing, kind of what we just said. If you have block scheduling, you would only have some teachers posting on some days and working around that. I'll go back to the comment I made about procrastination. Students tend to procrastinate when they first learn how to operate in an online environment. And so that, I think, is something you need to guard against. If you post something and don't expect the students to bring the work back until 2 or 3 weeks from now, when they show up in the regular classroom again, you will find many students that haven't done much. So you do have to have some way of grading completion, grading with letter grades periodically throughout this process. So if block scheduling gives them too much time between, you will find that some students haven't done much.
Perfect. And we have a lot of questions about how this could impact tuition and things like that. So I'm going to try to bundle a bunch of them together and respond kind of at once. So first of all, do you think that this moving to this situation during a time frame like this could impact enrollment? Would parents maybe just decide they might as well homeschool since they're doing the work anyway? And in addition to that, what do you do if you have parents who decide that because they're not in school, should they have to pay tuition for those days? So kind of a dual question for both of you.
Yeah, I'll kick it off here. I think it's a little more difficult with the younger, say, pre-K, EE, that type of thing. And so you want to look more at what's being provided, right? If most of us are going to say we're not providing childcare, we're providing an educational experience to those EE children, even though they might not be receiving a grade or something like that. And so, I think that's the basis of what you come back and say, I understand we're not at school in the building per se, but we are still doing education, right? And so the other thing is, this is for a limited duration. We're talking 2 to 4 weeks, more than likely, hopefully. And so you're providing, again, you're still providing a service, you're still providing an educational component. You may want to have that conversation. Do we want to lessen what that tuition is for those grades? but I think you've got a case to make there. For the K-12, you've got a much stronger case in that they're not paying for a certain number of days per se. They're paying for that 7th grade education or that 6th grade education. So there's most states there's going to be some kind of compulsory, there's a certain number of days that a student has to attend for a K-12 education, or a certain number of hours that have to be attained for a K-12 education. If there is going to be something like this that takes place, what is most likely going to happen is those public school districts and the private schools can ask for waivers, right? And those will be granted. That, let's say it's a 185-day school year. Well, we only hit 160 because of mandatory closures for coronavirus. You're going to get a waiver, and the parent is still getting the value of that education. That 6th grader still has all the things that show that they went to 6th grade. They meet the state standard for an education, whatever that might be. So I get the question, I get the concern, but I don't think it's something where you have to say you don't have to pay tuition or we're going to modify it. If you want to go into that conversation, you're more than welcome to. But unless you're not providing any kind of service, then it becomes a question of what do we want to do? Are we going to? It's not been unheard of to expand days at the end of the school year or something else if you're not going to do some kind of digital learning platform to provide. But those are other questions.
I'll make 2 comments here. One is parents are not providing the education. Parents are assisting, supervising, but the school is providing the education. So it's not the same as homeschooling. And parents need to understand that. And schools need to understand that's why they're not just providing assignments. If they were just providing homework or assignments, they are not providing the level of education that they need to be providing at this point. So that's why it's extremely important for schools, leaders, the instructional leader at school to help teachers understand. This isn't just say, turn to page 192 and do problems 6 through 25 in your math book. That's not instruction. So teachers need to understand the difference in that. Great.
A question for here, should we schedule recess time during their day even when they're at home, or is that too much?
It's probably with the younger elementary students, it's probably a good idea on that classroom page to continue to meet and address the social emotional needs of those kids. So we don't expect kids to work solid for 4 or 5 hours without a break. So it's probably a good thing to continue to tell kids this, do this, but don't forget to take a break. Don't forget to do this. Don't forget to do this, because kids learn better when they have these kinds of things. Get some exercise. There's even programs on the web that can get them up and active and, moving to music and those kinds of things. Probably a good idea to put on your classroom page.
There's several questions on should we shut down school and do a teacher training day with the system, or the stress levels of teachers, and what does that look like? And I'll let Erin address that, but just share from a practical standpoint, there are a number of public school districts around the country that are shutting down for a day or two to introduce and acclimate their entire staff to a new solution like we've been talking about today. And so that is currently happening in the public school sector, but again, I'll let Erin address that more specifically.
I agree. If it depends on how far along your school is. Do you have the expertise to do this? Have you done some of it? Some schools have been using Google Classroom for years. So it's not a big leap for them to move into this for several subjects in a day, or to be able to do it on a more full-time basis. So that's something you would need to determine. How far along the spectrum are you, and can you jump into this? Or if it's brand new, you probably do need to take a few days, bring somebody in that can help you if you don't have that expertise in your school.
And I would say too, having been in the classroom, that when you're doing this, one of the questions was, preventing teacher burnout and making sure that, that they're taken care of, which is a valid point. But in this kind of classroom where you're transitioning to an online, there's not a lot of direct instruction. That's one of the things that you have to avoid due to that asynchronous learning need. teachers are spending the time they normally would be doing direct instruction, preparing lesson plans and posting and getting those ready for the next day. So you're not looking at a full day of teaching and then hours in the evening of preparing the next day's lesson, just because of the way that works, I think. So we also had a question, K through second grade, if they're not logging into a web-based program daily, how do you track attendance?
Well, it depends on your system. If you still have a student management system, the parent can do that. It completely depends on what systems you have. Or the parent can just keep track of it at home and say, you know, the log or the journal, this is how much we did this day, this is how much we did this day, and then turn that in when they get back. It just depends on what systems you have.
Perfect. And somebody asked the question about RenWeb, which has an LMS built into that. Do you have any experience or knowledge about that particular?
I don't. We did not have RenWeb, but I know that some schools have it and use it for both. It's not as robust as Google Classroom and Moodle and so forth as an LMS, but it is trying to grow in that area. So it may be able to fill this need. And so again, take your tech people, take your tech educators, and see if it can do what you need it to do for this time.
Great. Did have a question about when those early education resources would be available. The early education team is working on that right now. So as soon as we have that, I'll be posting that up on the website for you. Any other questions out there? Looks like we do. How do we support our families in our school who have literally no internet outside of school?
Well, we did have a few of those families, and they solved it by going to a neighbor or taking their kids to work. We even had a few families that took their kids and went to the library, to the public library. So those were the three solutions that the families that we had that didn't have internet used.
I think with the internet question, this is a sort of a common standard that's now sort of an expectation. So I realize some parents don't have that, but it's not a reason not to do this. It's just an accepted standard that you either have an internet access or you will have the ability to access it. If it becomes a true hardship, you may be able to work with those handful of families to give them, let's say, a day lapse where they have an additional day to catch up, go that night to the library, print off what needs to be done or find out the assignments, and then so they're essentially a day behind. But again, that's only on an as-needed basis in a rather dire situation.
And there may be some environments where most of the families have a smartphone. So if you designed your materials for a smartphone mobile design, you could work with that. You would have to keep that in mind if that was your population, but you could do that.
So would you recommend if they aren't using online instruction at this particular time, should schools reach out to parents to get a kind of
Absolutely.
Pulse?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you might want to, if you're worried about that factor, you might want to just immediately do a survey and find out what are the resources that your families have.
So the questions come up for those families who don't have their internet access and there's a quarantine in place. Are those really realistic options? I would say a couple things. The world of Wi-Fi is a beautiful thing, and so I think you just have to be creative. You could do something as simple as, we will leave the school's Wi-Fi on. Here's the password. You come in the evening, right, with your phone. They're going to have a phone, if not a computer, and access the work that needs to be done at that point. But you don't have to necessarily go into a physical location. Libraries will work that same way. Your school may work that same way. Any coffee shop will work that same way. They may have the lights off, but their routers and their equipment are still running. And so you could family can stay in the car and drive to one of those places and access what they need from the car.
Do you think parents will be allowed to pick up books and assignments? Can they drop off their work? For those without Wi-Fi, that might be a help.
Again, it's going to depend. That's going to depend on the area. there may be some that would say yes, and if it's a hard hit area, they may say wait until, so we can't answer that in one way or another.
Yeah, one thing I would suggest you also want to consider, we didn't talk much about, but is to have the plan on how you're going to disseminate the content, whether that be a computer or a device or even books that students are going to need. So if this type of thing happens overnight, use Massachusetts as an example. They went from about 24 confirmed cases to 92 overnight. You need to have a plan in place of how are students going to come and pick things up. And so I would stagger that. Maybe it's one class at a time from, third grade does it from this hour period. And maybe on the other end, if your middle school or your high school is on the opposite end of the school from your elementary, third grade and 12th grade will come at these hours to pick things up. And then the next hour, but you get the idea. You're going to have to plan out how are we going to stagger to have the students come in and get these materials. If there's the chance that something will take place or you have the feeling that it's going to happen, then just take it home, just like you would for a planned snow day, right? We know blizzard's coming tomorrow. We're planning ahead. We know what to make sure the families have with them when they leave the school for the day.
Great. I'm not seeing any more questions coming in. For those of you who might have something that you haven't yet asked, now's the time to type that in. I'll give you a few seconds. In the meantime, just a reminder, this recording will be put up on our coronavirus website. That link is on the email that you received notifying you about this. It'll also be on an email that we send afterwards with a link to the recording once all of that is taken care of and rendered and everything.
If people have great ideas, they can jump on the community and share some ideas on the community.
Perfect. I was going to suggest that very thing. So we do have community. If you're an administrator, there is an administrator community, already have some conversations going on there. Great place to share resources and ideas, especially, you guys are down in the trenches trying to make this happen. And you may be able to work together to come up with solutions and ideas and thoughts together that you might not be able to do separately. Please take a look at that. The ACSI member group that all of you are engaged in as well also has some conversations going on there as well. So feel free to jump in and take care of that and keep in contact with each other. It does look like all of our questions are done. I'm not seeing any more coming in. So I want to take an opportunity to thank Dr. Wilcox and Philip both for coming in, answering some questions and being able to share this with you. We hope you found it of value. Please let us know if we can help in any way, and you guys have a great day.